the moment Fannie Boone rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a borrowed mule with dried mud caked from the hem of her dress clear up to her elbows. Every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared, as though a comet had just streaked across a cloudless noon sky. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat perched at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a rough stone balanced on a cliff, waiting to either become something remarkable or tumble into dust. Cattle drovers came through in thundering waves every season, spending money as fast as they earned it, and the town had grown up around that habit: saloons, a dry goods store, a livery, a hotel that smelled of sawdust and boot leather, and a modest office building where the cattle broker Graham Easton ran his operation out of 2 cramped rooms and a ledger that had grown alarmingly complicated. Fannie did not look like a woman who had plans. She looked like a woman who had survived something, which, as it turned out, was almost the same thing. She dismounted in front of the livery with the kind of practiced ease that said she had done it 1,000 times, handed the mule's reins to a boy who could not have been older than 14, pressed a coin into his palm, and then turned and walked directly toward the office building with the small painted sign above the door that read Easton Cattle Brokerage and Land Records. She had mud on her boots, mud on her coat, a streak of it along her jaw that she had not bothered to wipe away, and she carried herself like none of it mattered. In one hand she held a canvas satchel, worn soft with use. In the other she held nothing, but her fingers moved slightly as she walked, the way a person's fingers move when they are running numbers through their head. Inside the office, Graham Easton was sitting behind a desk that was losing a war with the paperwork stacked upon it. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work before he traded fence posts for ledgers, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in October, that particular shade of gray-blue that could not quite decide what it wanted to be. He had been awake since before dawn trying to reconcile a discrepancy in his cattle shipment records that had been haunting him for 3 weeks, and he had the look of a man who was beginning to suspect the numbers had been wrong from the beginning. His assistant, a young man named Pete Dolby, who was enthusiastic in exactly the wrong ways and slow in exactly the wrong moments, had placed an advertisement in 2 newspapers seeking a bookkeeper. Graham had interviewed 4 men over the past 10 days. The first had been unable to explain the difference between a debit and a credit. The second had explained it correctly, and then confessed he was mostly interested in the position as a way to learn the cattle trade so he could start competing with Graham directly. The third had poor eyesight and had not brought spectacles. The fourth had been perfectly qualified and had accepted a position in Wichita before the ink dried on his letter of acceptance. Graham was not feeling generous toward the concept of job applicants. The door opened, and Fannie Boone walked in. He looked up from his ledger, took in the mud, the worn satchel, the streak along her jaw, and the fact that she was alone and on foot in a cattle town, and appeared completely unbothered by all 3 of those things. And he said, with the particular flatness of a man who has run out of patience, "We are closed for interviews today." Fannie looked at him the way a person looks at a thundercloud when they have already decided to walk through the rain regardless. She pulled out the chair across from his desk, sat down, set the satchel on her knees and said, "That is interesting because your advertisement did not mention interview hours." Graham set down his pen. He looked at her more carefully now, the way he looked at cattle contracts when something in the wording bothered him. She was 26, with dark auburn hair pinned back severely in a way that had not quite survived whatever journey she had made to get here, because several strands had escaped and were doing as they pleased. She had a frank, steady gaze, brown eyes with something sharp and measuring in them, and hands that she kept still and folded in her lap with the deliberateness of someone who had learned early that restless hands made people nervous. "I am Fannie Boone," she said. "I was bookkeeper for the Harlan Cross Cattle Company in Abilene for 4 years. Before that I kept the accounts for my father's dry goods operation in Emporia for 3 years, starting at 19. I can work double entry ledgers. I can reconcile cattle shipment records across multiple buyers and sellers simultaneously. I can read a contract and find the clause that will cause trouble before it causes trouble. And I can write a business letter that does not sound like it was composed by someone hitting a typewriter with their elbows. Graham opened his mouth. Fannie was not finished. She reached into the satchel and withdrew a leather folder, opened it on the desk in front of him, and continued. I have letters of character from Robert Harlan himself, from the Cattlemen's Association of Dickinson County, and from Judge Theodore Mace of Emporia, who has known my family for 20 years and will vouch for my honesty with the kind of specificity that makes a reference actually useful. She paused for exactly one beat. I also noticed from across the room that your March shipment column does not balance, and I believe it is because you have recorded the Whitmore delivery twice and the Denton delivery not at all. If you would like me to demonstrate, I only need a few minutes with that ledger. The office was very quiet for a moment. Graham looked at the leather folder. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Fannie Boone, who looked back at him with perfect patience, mud and all. He said, "You are hired," and meant it so completely that it surprised him. Fannie said, "I have not finished discussing salary." He said, "Name it," and she did, and it was reasonable, and he agreed, and that was that. She was not wrong about the Whitmore delivery. The first few weeks were a study in professional negotiation of the kind that neither of them had anticipated. The office had only 2 desks, which meant Fannie sat approximately 6 feet from Graham for 8 to 10 hours a day, and the space between those 2 desks became a kind of charged territory that both of them were careful about in ways they did not examine too closely. Graham was a man of order and economy, in his words if not in his paperwork. He spoke directly, rarely explained himself when he felt the meaning was clear, and had a habit of going very quiet when he was thinking hard that some people mistook for coldness. He was not cold. He was simply the kind of person who believed that words cost something and therefore spent them carefully. Fannie was the kind of person who made precision look effortless, who could carry 3 conversations in her head simultaneously while writing numbers with her right hand and checking a different column with her left. She was also unexpectedly funny, in the dry, understated way of someone who has been underestimated so many times that it has become a source of private, steady amusement. She did not perform her competence. She simply exercised it, and the result was that things got done around her with a kind of quiet inevitability. Pete Dolby was afraid of her within the first week, not because she was unkind to him. She was not. But because she caught 3 of his filing errors on the same afternoon with a pleasantness that made the catching feel worse than a reprimand would have. The town of Caldwell had opinions about Fannie Boone, which was inevitable. A woman working in a cattle brokerage office was not unheard of in 1878 Kansas, but it was not common either, and Caldwell was the kind of town that treated anything uncommon as fair game for discussion. Some of it was simply curiosity. Some of it, particularly from the men who had been passed over for the bookkeeper position, was less generous. Graham heard the talk. He had not yet decided what to do with his feelings about it when Fannie made the decision for him by doing her job so competently that the talk shifted from skepticism to a grudging and somewhat bewildered respect, which felt more satisfying than any defense he might have mounted on her behalf. He told her so one afternoon in April when she had spent the morning sorting out a 3-way dispute between a cattle seller, a buyer, and a shipping company that had been causing headaches for 2 months, and had resolved it so neatly that all 3 parties left the office looking as though they had gotten what they wanted. "You did not need me to say anything," he said. She looked up from the letter she was drafting. "No," she said, "but it is nice that you recognized it." There was a pause. "How did you end up in Abilene?" he asked. It was the most personal question he had asked her since she arrived. She was quiet for a moment, considering. "My father died in 1873, she said. "The dry goods store went to my brother, who was 14 at the time and who had more interest in farming than accounting. I was 21 and I had been keeping the book since I was 19, and I knew how to do it well. Harlan Cross had an opening in Abilene. I applied. They hired me because no one else applied who could actually do the work. She paused. Then they moved the main operation to Dodge City in '77 and told me the Abilene office was closing and offered me a position in Dodge. You did not want Dodge City. Dodge City wanted a man. They did not say so in writing, but they said so in every other way available to them. So I saw your advertisement in the Wichita paper and came here instead. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Their loss." Fannie smiled at her letter. It was the kind of smile that she did not intend for him to see, and he saw it anyway, and something in his chest did something complicated that he chose not to investigate at that particular moment. The cattle season in 1878 was a complicated one. The Kishom Trail was still running strong. The great railroad push that would eventually redirect the cattle drives had not yet fully reached its conclusion, and Caldwell sat in the middle of a commercial storm that required constant management. Graham handled the brokerage side, the negotiations and contracts, the dealings with the Texas drovers coming up through Indian Territory. Fannie handled the accounting and records with an efficiency that gradually began to change the fundamental character of the office. Where there had been 3 weeks of backlogged reconciliation, there were now current ledgers. Where contracts had been filed in a system that bore a closer resemblance to geology than to organization, things simply layered on top of each other in roughly chronological order, there was now a filing system that Pete Dolby complained about for 2 days and then admitted was much easier to use. Where discrepancies had accumulated like debts, they were now caught and addressed as they appeared. Graham noticed all of this with the particular satisfaction of a man watching something he had built become better than he had managed to make it himself. He noticed other things too. He noticed that Fannie took her lunch sitting at her desk most days, eating whatever she had packed without complaint, but that on Fridays she allowed herself 30 minutes at the restaurant 2 doors down, and that she always ordered the same thing, and that she always had a book with her, which she read with the focused attention of someone who treated reading as a serious business rather than a pastime. He noticed that she had a habit, when a calculation frustrated her, of pressing her thumbnail against her lower lip while she stared at the numbers, a small private gesture of concentration that she seemed entirely unaware of. He noticed that she had a particular way of dealing with difficult men, the cattle drovers who came in expecting her to defer to Pete or to Graham, who spoke over her or past her, or addressed their questions to the nearest man, even when Fannie was the one who had answered them, which was to continue calmly providing the correct answers until the situation either resolved itself naturally or the man in question became so thoroughly shown up by his own behavior that he had no choice but to address her directly. She never made a scene. She never needed to. He noticed, most of all, that the office was better when she was in it, and not only in the accounting sense. He took her out to dinner in May. He told himself it was a business dinner because they had a contract to review that had grown complicated enough to warrant extended discussion, and the office after hours was stuffy and badly lit. He made this case to himself with great thoroughness and did not entirely believe a word of it. The restaurant was the best in Caldwell, which was not a very high bar, but it had tablecloths and a cook who had come from somewhere east and still remembered what food could taste like with proper attention. Fannie had changed from her work dress, which surprised him. Not that she had changed, but that the dress she had changed into was a deep green that made her hair look different, warmer, and that she had unpinned it partially so that it fell in loose waves rather than being held severely back, and that the combination of these things hit him in a place behind his sternum with a force that he found extremely inconvenient. They talked about the contract for approximately 45 minutes, and then, because neither of them was particularly practiced at pretending to be talking about one thing when they were clearly doing something else, They simply stopped talking about the contract. She told him about growing up in Emporia, about her father, who had been a serious, quiet man with an extraordinary ability for numbers, who had taught her bookkeeping the way other fathers taught their sons to ride, as a fundamental skill, something the world required and you had better know how to do well. About her mother, who had died when Fannie was 16, and who had been, by all her accounts, the funnier and more sociable half of the partnership, the one who remembered everyone's names and brought food to sick neighbors and made the house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Graham told her about his ranch, which he had not entirely given up. He still owned the land, 30 acres east of town, though he had hired a man to manage the small herd he kept. About his own father, who had come out from Ohio in 1859 with the specific intention of making his fortune, and who had instead made a decent living, which he had eventually made peace with. About his brother Will, who was living in Colorado now and who wrote letters about the mountains with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered religion late in life. "Do you miss the ranch?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I miss the quiet of it," he said. "The brokerage is never quiet." But the ranch was lonely in a way I did not know what to do with. She nodded as though she understood that particular geography of feeling. "The accounting office in Abilene was never lonely," she said, "but it was also never mine. I was always working inside someone else's system, correcting it but not owning it." He looked at her. "What would yours look like?" The question sat between them for a moment. She picked up her coffee cup, thought, and set it back down. "Honestly, probably very similar to what we have now, except the filing would have been right from the beginning." He laughed, and it surprised both of them, because he did not laugh easily, and this one came out whole and unguarded. And Fannie smiled at him with the kind of warmth that a person gives when they have caused genuine delight in someone they respect, and the evening shifted into something that neither of them named but both of them felt. He walked her back to the boarding house where she rented a room from Mrs. Aldred, who had opinions about everything and kept a clean establishment, and made the best biscuits in Caldwell, according to everyone who had eaten them, including Fannie, who was not given to exaggeration. They stood on the porch for a moment in the late spring dark with the sounds of the saloon 2 streets over drifting toward them faintly, fiddle music and the occasional raised voice. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "The contract," he said, "required discussion." "It did," she agreed, with a gravity that was entirely theatrical and that he appreciated immensely. He walked home alone with the distinct sensation of a man who has made a discovery he is not sure how to categorize. The summer of 1878 brought the cattle drives in force. The streets of Caldwell filled with Texas longhorns and the men who drove them dusty, tired, relieved to have made it through Indian territory without incident, ready to spend money and sleep in a real bed and eat something other than trail cooking. The brokerage was overwhelmed with work in the good way, the way that meant the business was succeeding, and Graham and Fannie and poor Pete Dolby worked 12-hour days as a matter of course. It was during this period that Fannie demonstrated the other skill that had not been mentioned in her letter of application, the one that turned out to matter most in the context of Caldwell in 1878. A cattle drive arrived from Texas in late June, led by a man named Cord Pelham, who ran a respectable operation down in Gonzales County and who had been bringing herds up the Kishom Trail since 1870. He arrived to discover that the buyer who had contracted for his cattle 6 months prior had gone bankrupt, that the contract was therefore worthless, and that he had 1,400 head of cattle and nowhere to sell them. He was not a violent man, but he was an extremely angry one, and his anger filled the office like weather. Graham was in the middle of this situation, trying to determine whether there was any legal recourse and simultaneously trying to locate another buyer, when Fannie looked up from her desk and said, "Mr. Pelham, before this becomes worse than it needs to be, can I ask you something about your herd?" Cord Pelham, who had barely registered that there was a woman in the room because he had been directing all his anger and attention at Graham, turned and looked at her. "What?" he said, in a tone that was not exactly welcoming. "What is your bottom price per head, and do you have flexibility on the grade breakdown?" He stared at her. "What?" "Your contract was for 1,400 head at a fixed price per head with no grade differential. Most buyers in this market are interested in grade differentials. If you can tell me the actual breakdown of your herd first, second, third grade, I can calculate whether there is a price structure that would be attractive to at least 2 buyers I know are currently in Caldwell who had not matched to available supply yet this season." Cord Pelham sat down slowly in the chair across from her desk, which nobody had asked him to do, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected a fight and found himself instead in a negotiation. "All right," he said. "Grade breakdown is about 40% firsts, 50% seconds, 10% thirds." Fannie wrote that down. Her pencil moved quickly. Graham leaned against his own desk and watched her with his arms crossed, and something in his expression that Pete Dolby later described to his wife as the look of a man who has just realized he is in a great deal of trouble in the best possible way. By the end of the afternoon, Fannie had brokered a deal with 2 separate buyers, splitting the herd, and had negotiated a price structure that left Cord Pelham with 17% more per head on his firsts than his original contract had specified, at the cost of accepting the market rate on his thirds, which worked out to a net gain over the original contract of approximately $80. Plus the cattle were sold, and he could pay his drovers and go home. Cord Pelham shook her hand when he left, which was not common in 1878, and said, "Where have you been my whole career?" and walked out looking like a different man than the one who had walked in. Graham looked at Fannie after the door closed. She was already updating the ledger. "Fannie," he said, "the commission structure needs to be adjusted," she said without looking up, "because a split buyer sale has different cost implications than a single sale, and the current commission schedule does not account for that." "Fannie," she looked up. "That was extraordinary," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I just looked at what was actually available," she said. "You were working on the legal angle because that is the natural response to a contract failure. I was looking at the numbers. Both were necessary." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I mean." She looked at him for a moment more than was strictly necessary for a professional exchange of observations, and then she went back to the ledger, and Graham went back to his desk, and Pete Dolby, who had witnessed the entire thing from his corner of the office, said later that the air in that room was the strangest thing he had ever experienced indoors. There was a man in Caldwell that summer named Horace Dent, who had arrived in June claiming to be an independent cattle buyer from Missouri. He was well-dressed and smooth-talking and had rented a room at the hotel and spent his evenings at the best table in the saloon, and various people in town had done various degrees of business with him with various results. Graham had done no business with him at all. Something about Horace Dent bothered him in a way that he could not fully articulate, the way a fence post that looks fine from a distance reveals a subtle lean up close that tells you the ground underneath it has shifted. Fannie met Horace Dent in early July when he came into the office wanting to discuss a purchase of 200 head from a drover who had used Graham's brokerage for the transaction. The drover had already left town. The deal was done. There was nothing for Dent to discuss. He sat across from Fannie's desk anyway and talked at her for 20 minutes about the cattle market, watching her with the particular attention of a man who has noticed something and is deciding how useful it might be. When he left, Fannie said to Graham without preamble, "He did not come here about the cattle." Graham looked up. "No. He was asking me questions about your client list." He was not obvious about it, but every third question circled back to who your regular sellers are and what their typical volumes look like. Graham set down his pen. "Did you tell him anything?" "I told him the same things that are publicly available from the Cattle Association records," she said. which is nothing useful to someone trying to build a competing client list, but which prevented him from realizing I had understood what he was actually doing. She paused. He will come back. Why? Because he thinks I am easier to get information from than you are. The flatness of this assessment, entirely without vanity or offense, made him want to smile. He did not. And when he comes back, I will be politely useless to him until we know more about what he actually wants. Dent came back twice more over the following 3 weeks. Both times Fannie engaged him with a warmth that was perfectly judge-friendly enough to keep him coming back, opaque enough to give him nothing. She also, during this period, quietly reviewed the contracts that had been signed by sellers who were known to have also spoken with Dent, looking for any irregularities. She found one. A seller named Beaumont Graves had signed a contract with Graham's brokerage in March for a summer delivery, but the terms of the contract included a clause about payment timing that was slightly non-standard, and when Fannie tracked back through the correspondence, she found a letter from Dent to Graves that had been filed in the wrong folder by Pete, which suggested Dent had been in contact with Graves before the contract was signed, and may have influenced the terms in ways that would benefit him indirectly. She brought this to Graham on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, spreading the documents across his desk and walking him through the thread with the methodical clarity of someone who has rehearsed the explanation enough times to make it clean. Graham listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long did this take you?" "Evenings," she said. "About 2 weeks of evenings." He looked at the documents and then at her. "You did this on your own time." "It is your business," she said, as if this explained everything, and to her it clearly did. He went to the marshal's office the next morning and presented what Fannie had found. The marshal, a steady, unflappable man named Jonas Price, reviewed it and paid Horace Dent a visit that same afternoon. Dent left Caldwell within 24 hours, which told them everything they needed to know about the depth of his confidence in his own position. Beaumont Graves's contract was renegotiated to standard terms. He was not particularly happy about it, but he was given a clear explanation of why the original terms had been suspect, and he was a fair man, and he accepted it. Graham said nothing to Fannie about any of this beyond a simple, direct, "Thank you," which he said the morning after Dent left town, standing in the doorway of the office while she was unlocking it, speaking with the particular quietness of a person who means something completely and does not want to dilute it with additional words. She nodded once. She unlocked the door. They went in and started the day. But something had shifted, and both of them knew it, in the way that you know that the temperature has dropped by 5 degrees even before you have consciously registered it as cold. The social life of Caldwell in 1878 was not entirely composed of saloons and cattle transactions. There were church services on Sunday that a substantial portion of the town attended, partly from conviction and partly from habit, and partly because it was one of the few indoor social occasions available that did not involve whiskey. There were occasional dances held at the community hall, which attracted the more settled population of the town, the merchants, the families, the ranchers with land nearby. There were dinners and card evenings, and the quiet domestic arrangements that accumulate wherever people decide to stay somewhere long enough to call it home. Fannie had been attending Sunday services since her second week in Caldwell, sitting near the back with Mrs. Aldred, who had adopted her with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere new and alone, and needed something to hold on to. Graham attended less regularly, showing up when the demands of the season permitted and sitting in his usual place near the front on the left side, which he had occupied since the church was built, because habits of geography run deep. They had never sat together at church. This was not a decision either of them had made. It was simply how it had happened. But one Sunday in August, when Graham arrived slightly late because of a problem with the mail delivery, the left side near the front was unexpectedly full, and the only available seat was next to Fannie, who had moved forward from her usual back row position at Mrs. Aldridge's insistence, because the older woman had wanted a better view of the visiting choir. Graham sat down. Fannie moved her hymnal slightly to make room. They sang the same hymns from the same book, not touching, with approximately 6 inches of space between them that felt charged in a way that church pews were probably not designed for. After the service, walking back through the bright August morning with the dust of the street warm and the smell of August grass coming in from the prairie, Mrs. Aldridge said to Fannie, with the particular accuracy of old women who have spent 63 years watching other people, "That man is in love with you, dear, and he is taking his time about it because he is afraid of doing it wrong. You might give him some indication that he is not going to be destroyed if he does it right." Fannie said, "Mrs. Aldridge." Mrs. Aldridge said, "I am not asking for an argument, I am giving you information." Fannie did not respond to this, but that evening she sat on the porch of the boarding house in the late summer warmth and thought about it with the same focused honesty she brought to everything else, and she admitted to herself that Mrs. Aldridge was probably correct about everything except possibly the order of things, because Fannie was fairly certain she was also in love with Graham Easton, and had been for some time without having named it to herself, and that she too had been careful about it. Careful in the way that a woman who has been competent and independent for her entire adult life is sometimes careful about admitting she wants something that feels personal rather than professional, as if wanting it might somehow compromise the solidity of everything else. She recognized, being ridiculous. She resolved to stop being ridiculous, and then sat there for another hour thinking about exactly how Graham Easton laughed when he was genuinely surprised by something, and how he always held the office door for her, not in the reflexive way of a man performing a courtesy, but in the particular way of someone who has noticed that you are carrying something and would like to make the door less of a problem for you, and how he had looked at her when she had brokered Cord Pelham's cattle deal. That look that Pete had apparently described accurately, and she went to bed feeling entirely clear about what she wanted and entirely uncertain about what to do with that clarity. The dance in September resolved it, not because dances resolve things in the organized way of a ledger column adding up to a clean total, but because they create the kind of occasion where the normal geography of daily life shifts enough that people are allowed to occupy different positions than usual. It was held on a Saturday in the community hall, lanterns hung across the ceiling, a fiddle player, and a man with a guitar and someone's teenage son on the harmonica who was surprisingly talented. The whole town came, or the part of the town that was in the habit of attending such things. There was punch that Mrs. Aldridge had brought, which tasted of sugar and ginger and was entirely non-alcoholic, which she mentioned to several people with the satisfaction of someone who expects praise. Fannie arrived in a blue dress that was not new but had been pressed carefully, and Graham was already there, standing with a rancher named Caldwell on the far side of the room, and the moment she came through the door he looked up in the way that people look up when they are somehow expecting something without knowing they are expecting it. They circled each other for about 40 minutes in the social way of people at a community gathering, talking to other people, moving around the room, acknowledging each other with nods and brief exchanges as they passed, but not occupying the same conversation. This was almost certainly accidental to begin with and became deliberate somewhere around the 40-minute mark, and by the time the fiddle player struck up a waltz, they were both aware of having not yet danced with each other with an awareness that was beginning to feel architectural. Graham crossed the room. He stood in front of her. He said, "Fannie," and then stopped as though he had used up his planned sentence. She said, "Yes." He said, "Would you dance with me?" She said, "I have been waiting the better part of an hour for you to ask me." He looked at her for a moment. A slow smile came across his face, the full, unhurried kind that she had seen only a handful of times, the kind that changed his whole face from composed to unguarded. "Have you?" he said. "I have," she said, and took his hand. They danced the waltz and then another, and did not let go of each other's hands between songs in the way that says without words that something has been decided. Later, when the evening had wound down and people were beginning to drift home, they stood outside the community hall in the September night with the stars wild overhead the way they are in Kansas when there is no cloud cover and no city lights to compete, which is to say excessively, abundantly, with the particular generosity of a sky that has nothing to prove. Graham said, "I want to say something to you that I have not said before." Fannie said, "All right." "I think," he said carefully, the way he said everything that mattered, "that you are the most capable and interesting person I have ever met, and I think that I would like to—" He paused, began again. "I think that whatever this is, whatever has been happening since you walked into my office in April covered in mud and told me my ledger was wrong, I would like it to continue, and to be more than it currently is." She was quiet for a moment. The fiddle player was packing up inside. They could hear the muffled sounds of the community hall emptying. "Graham," she said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 6th week of my employment, and I have been entirely professional about it because I value the work and I was not certain you felt the same way, and I am now reasonably certain that you do, so I would like us to stop being quite so careful and simply acknowledge what this is." He looked at her with something in his expression that was simple and clear and entirely unguarded. "What is it?" he asked, and it was not really a question. "It is love," she said. "At least on my part." "On both parts," he said, and then he kissed her there in the September dark outside the community hall in Caldwell, Kansas, with the stars doing their excessive best overhead. And it was not the tentative kiss of two people who are uncertain, but the quiet, deliberate kiss of two people who have finally arrived somewhere they have been moving toward for months. October brought the end of the cattle season and the first real cold, the kind of cold that came in off the plains with authority, and Caldwell settled into the quieter rhythm of the off-season. The drovers had gone home to Texas. The buyers had dispersed. The brokerage hummed along on its winter work. The contracts, the record-keeping for the season just completed, the negotiations for next year's agreements, the careful building of the financial picture that would carry the business through to the next spring. Graham and Fannie worked side by side with the new addition of knowing what they were to each other, which changed the quality of the space between them without changing the work. They still disagreed on methods occasionally, argued points of contract interpretation with mutual enthusiasm, and competed in a friendly and absolutely transparent way about who could spot a ledger discrepancy faster, a competition that Fannie was winning with a consistency that Graham found both annoying and completely wonderful. They took dinner together most evenings. They walked on Sundays after church, out east of town where Graham's land was, through the brown autumn grass with the sky enormous in every direction. He showed her the house on the property, which he had not much attended to since moving into town, a solidly built stone house with good bones and considerable neglect. She walked through every room with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "The windows on the east side need recalking," she said. "The kitchen stove has a crack in the firebox that will be dangerous in winter. The back porch is sound, but the roof over it has lost 2 shingles and needs them replaced before the snow." She paused, standing in the front room with the afternoon light coming in dusty through the streaked windows. "But the structure is excellent. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." He was standing behind her, watching her appraise his house the way she appraised a balance sheet. "My father built it," he said. "In 1863, she turned. "He built this himself. With 2 hired men and my mother's continuous architectural opinions, yes." She smiled, looking around the room again. She had good opinions. She did. Something about the way he said it told her what he had not yet told her, that his mother was gone, and that the loss was old enough to have settled into something livable but not old enough to be without weight. She did not push at it. She simply came and stood beside him, looking at the room with him, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He proposed to her in November. He did not do it dramatically, which was consistent with his character, but he did it with an intention and a sincerity that had nothing restrained about it. They were in the office late on a Wednesday afternoon, the last light of the November day coming through the window cold and gold, the stove in the corner throwing warmth. Fannie had her coat on because she was about to leave. She had reached the end of the current reconciliation project and was satisfied with it, and was preparing to go back to the boarding house for dinner. He was standing by the window with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the street in the way he had when he was thinking about something that wasn't the street. "Fannie," he said. She said, closing the ledger. "I want to marry you." She went still. Not with surprise, not exactly. She had been aware for weeks that they were moving toward this, that it was the natural direction of everything that had been happening between them. But the words were still something, still landed with weight and meaning, and she took a moment to receive them properly. She put the ledger on the shelf. She turned. He was looking at her now, not out the window, and his expression was the same one he had had in September outside the community hall, entirely clear, entirely without performance. "I want to marry you," he said again, "and I want you to keep the books, and I want you to keep telling me when my ledger is wrong, and I want to fix the east windows and the stove in that house, and I want to live there with you, and I want everything that comes after that." She was quiet for a moment that was not uncertainty, but rather the full, considered reception of something she had wanted and was now allowing herself to want completely. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her with the warmth and directness of a man who has been careful for a very long time and is now done being careful. They were married in December, in the church in Caldwell, on a day that was brilliant and cold with the kind of winter sky that exists only on the plains, vast and impossibly blue, so sharp and clear it hurt to look at. Mrs. Aldred cried with enormous satisfaction. Pete Dolby was there with his wife. Cord Pelham, who had heard the news somehow, sent a letter of congratulations from Texas that arrived 2 weeks late but was appreciated. Jonas Price, the marshal, attended and shook Graham's hand and told Fannie that the town was better for having her in it, which she received with the same quiet directness with which she received everything. The ceremony was simple, and the words were the old words, the ones that meant what they said, and when the minister pronounced them married and Graham looked at his wife, Fannie Boone, who was now Fannie Easton, though she would continue to be Fannie Boone to everyone who had known her under that name, and she had discussed this, and they had agreed that names carried their own history and did not need to be erased, when he looked at her in the cold blue December light. Something in him settled in the way that things settle when they find the right position after a long time of being slightly misaligned. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They moved into the stone house east of town at the beginning of January, after the east windows had been recalked, the kitchen stove replaced, and the back porch roof repaired, work that Graham had done with help from his hired man, Tom Webb, a quiet, competent man of 40 who had been managing the small herd, and who took the change in the household's population with the unflappable pragmatism of someone who had seen most things. The house, attended to and warmed, was exactly what Fannie had assessed in October: good bones, good light, a solidity that had been built to last. She had opinions about the arrangement of the furniture, which she expressed once and then left to Graham, who surprised her by taking most of them. She had further opinions about the kitchen, where she was not a talented cook, but intended to become a better one, which she approached with the same methodical will she brought to every skill deficit she identified in herself. She continued at the brokerage every day. This had never been in question for either of them. The work was hers as much as Graham's at this point. The business would not have run the same without her, and they both knew it, and the arrangement suited them both. Graham rode into town each morning on his horse, and Fannie rode beside him on a chestnut mare named Clementine that Graham had given her in October, which was the most romantic gift Fannie had ever received. a fact she found slightly alarming about herself and also completely accurate. The winter was quiet in the particular way of Kansas winters, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful so much as enormous. The plains under snow, the sky the particular white that means more snow coming, the wind a presence rather than a sound. They were inside the stone house most evenings, and the evenings were full in the way that evenings are when shared with someone you love and work beside and want to know further, reading, talking, the long, slow conversations of two people who are interested in each other and are finding that the supply of things to discover is larger than anticipated. In February, Fannie told Graham she was pregnant. He was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the weekly receipts, which he had brought home to review in the warmth, and when she told him, he looked up at her with an expression that passed through about 4 different things in quick succession before arriving at something that was purely, openly joy, uncomplicated and complete. He stood up and came to her and held her for a long moment, and she let him. And the kitchen was warm and the Kansas winter was outside the walls, and the stone house held them both. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice quiet in her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am also going to need you to adjust the commission schedule before the spring season, because I intend to work as long as I reasonably can. And the schedule has a structural problem that will cause unnecessary confusion during the first month of the drive season, and I would like to address it before the baby makes desk work uncomfortable." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and she looked back at him with the expression that was simultaneously entirely serious about the commission schedule and entirely warm about everything else, and he laughed, the full unguarded laugh, and said, "You are remarkable," with the tone of a man who says the word and means every letter of it. "The commission schedule," she said. "Tomorrow," he said, and kissed her forehead and went back to the kitchen table, and she sat down beside him and they worked through the evening together with the receipts and the commission problem and the general business of being two people who have built something together that is larger than either of them made alone. Spring came back with its usual force, the Kishom Trail waking up again, the first Texas drovers making it into Indian Territory by April and arriving in Caldwell through May and June. The brokerage was busy. Fannie worked until June, when the baby was due in August and the desk had indeed become impractical, and then worked from the stone house on the portions of the accounting that did not require her presence in the office, which turned out to be most of them, sending paperwork back and forth with Pete, who had grown considerably in competence over the past year, and who handled the office presence with far more reliability than he had demonstrated when Fannie had first arrived. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a hot afternoon when the plains around Caldwell shimmered in the heat, delivered by Dr. Helen Mears, who had been practicing in Caldwell for 2 years, and who had the particular calmness of a person who has learned that calm is the most useful thing you can bring to a difficult room. He was a solid, loud, objecting presence from the first moment, and Graham, who had been out in the hall because that was the arrangement and had heard everything, came in after the doctor had signaled that everything was well, and stood by the bed looking at his son with an expression that could only be described as entirely destroyed in the best possible way. "He is healthy," Fannie said. She was tired in a way that was fundamental rather than superficial, but her voice was clear. "The doctor says he is excellent." Graham sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the baby and then at Fannie and back at the baby. "He has your hands," he said. "Look at his hands." Fannie looked. "He does," she said, and something in that small observation, the recognition of herself in this new person, moved through her with a force she had not anticipated. They named him Robert James Easton. Robert for her father and James for Graham's, 2 quiet men who had built things with their hands and their attention, and whose names were worth carrying forward. Robert was a demanding baby in the way that healthy babies are, and the stone house reorganized itself around him with the thoroughness that new parents recognize as both exhausting and absolute. Graham, who had no experience with babies and said so honestly, learned with the same steady application he brought to everything, feeding and soothing and carrying without complaint through the dark hours of early morning while Fannie recovered her strength. By October, with the cattle season winding down and Robert sleeping through the night in his crib by the window, the stone house had settled into a new version of itself, noisier, warmer, more complicated, better. Fannie was back at the brokerage 3 half-days a week by November, which was not the schedule she had kept before, but was what the circumstances currently allowed, and she managed the accounting for the full season from those 3 half-days, because she had organized the systems well enough that they largely ran themselves, and because Pete Dolby had become, under her instruction over the past year and a half, actually competent in the day-to-day management. Graham watched this with the quiet pride of a man who has watched someone he loves build something that works. He had conversations with Fannie about the business in the evenings, over dinner, while Robert slept, the same way they had always talked about the business as partners, as people who were building something together and were genuinely interested in making it better. In the spring of 1880, they took on a second bookkeeper, a young woman named Della Worth, who came from Wichita with a letter of recommendation that Fannie read and approved with the same critical eye she had brought to every piece of paper that passed through the brokerage. Della was 22 and determined, and slightly in awe of Fannie, who treated this with gentle pragmatism, not discouraging the regard but not letting it substitute for actual instruction. The brokerage grew through 1880 and into 1881, steady and careful in the way that growth is when it is built on solid accounting rather than speculation. Graham expanded the land records portion of the business, which had always been a secondary service, and which proved, as the cattle trade began to show the first signs of its eventual change, to be increasingly important as settlers moved onto the plains and land ownership became a more complicated business. Fannie saw this before Graham did, saw the numbers shifting, the patterns in the records that suggested the cattle-only model needed supplementing, and they had the argument about it in the spring of 1881 with the mutual enthusiasm that characterized the arguments they had about the business, which were not fights so much as vigorous investigations of a problem from different angles. "The cattle numbers are still strong," Graham said. "This year," Fannie said, "and next year possibly. But look at the land transaction volume from the past 18 months compared to the preceding 3 years. The ratio is shifting. The railroad expansion is going to change the drive routes, and we both know it. If we have built the land records side into something substantial before that shift completes, we will be positioned rather than scrambling." He looked at her figures. He studied them for a long time. "You have been building this argument for how long?" he said. 6 months, she said. "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." He put the figures down. "Let us talk about what that expansion would require." They talked about it for 3 evenings, going through the costs and the staffing requirements and the legal dimensions. Land recording required relationships with the county courthouse that the cattle brokerage did not currently have, and by the end of the 3rd evening, they had a plan that was practical and specific and built on Fannie's numbers, which had always been the best numbers in the room. The expansion of the land records business over the following 2 years was one of the better decisions the brokerage made, and Graham said so when it became clear, in 1883, that the cattle drives through Caldwell were indeed beginning to diminish as the railroad pushed further west and south and changed the geography of the trade. The land work filled the gap. By this time, Robert was 4 years old and had opinions about everything, a trait he had inherited from both parents equally, and which expressed itself primarily through questions, endless, specific, occasionally unanswerable questions about how things worked, and why they were the way they were, and what would happen if they were different. Fannie answered these with the same patient precision she brought to every inquiry, and Graham answered them with a storyteller's instinct that surprised her with its richness. He turned out to be an excellent father in a way that was not obvious from the outside, because it was not performed, it was simply the steady daily presence of someone who was genuinely interested in the person his son was becoming. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Ann. She was smaller than Robert had been and quieter, and observed everything from her earliest weeks with dark, intent eyes that both parents found somewhat unnerving in their solemnity. Robert, who had been the center of the household's attention for 3 years and had taken the news of an incoming sibling with philosophical skepticism, came around completely within the first week when Clara grabbed his finger and held on with the grip that newborns have, absolute and unquestioning. He looked at Fannie after this happened with an expression of pure astonishment. "She is very strong," he said. "She is," Fannie said. "Can she hear?" "Yes." "Can she understand things?" "Not yet words," Fannie said, "but she understands voices and warmth, and that she is safe." Robert considered this seriously. "I will talk to her," he said, as though accepting a responsibility, and from that day forward he did, with the confident authority of an older sibling who has decided to conduct the new arrival's education personally. The years between 1882 and 1885 were the best years, though they did not know they were the best years while they were inside them, which is the nature of good years. They reveal themselves as such in retrospect, when you have the distance to see their shape. The brokerage was thriving. The stone house was full. Robert grew into a lanky, curious boy who rode well and read voraciously, and had his mother's gift for numbers, and his father's way of going quiet when he was thinking hard. Clara grew into a small, composed girl who was methodical and precise, and had an entirely unexpected gift for music that expressed itself through Mrs. Aldrid's old piano, which Fannie bought when Mrs. Aldrid decided she was too old to play it, and would rather hear it played by someone who would put it to use. Mrs. Aldrid was still alive, still keeping her boarding house, still having opinions about everything. She had become what she had begun to become the day Fannie arrived, something between a neighbor and an adopted grandmother, present at the births of both children, present at the table for Sunday dinners with increasing regularity, present at the edges of the family's life in the quiet way of someone who has decided to love people and is simply doing it without making a fuss. In 1884, the cattle trail had mostly redirected around Caldwell, and the town was adjusting to the change with the practical determination of a place that had been built by people who were not strangers to change. The brokerage had by this point shifted its primary income to land records and property transactions, which the expanding settlement of the Kansas plains was generating in abundance. New families arrived constantly, people coming from east of the Missouri with hope and farming implements and children, buying land and needing someone to record it and manage the legal documents properly. Fannie had become, by this point, something she had not anticipated becoming when she rode into Caldwell on a borrowed mule in the spring of 1878, a fixture of the town, someone people consulted not only for accounting, but for the kind of practical, clear-eyed advice that came from years of watching money move through the community and understanding the patterns it made. She was not the first person anyone thought of when they imagined authority in Caldwell. That was still a reflexive male landscape in 1884 Kansas. But she was the first person that certain people went to when they needed something done correctly and understood, and over time that category had expanded in ways that were more significant than the official kind of recognition. Graham saw this and was proud of it in a way that was straightforward and without complication, because he had never needed her to be smaller than she was. If anything, watching her become larger in the world she moved in had only made him more certain that the day she had walked into his office in April of 1878, covered in mud, and carrying her leather folder and her precise speech and her sharper-than-expected eye, had been the luckiest day of his professional and personal life simultaneously. He told her this one evening in the summer of 1884, sitting on the porch of the stone house after the children were in bed, with the Kansas evening doing its summer thing warm, heavy with grass smell, the stars appearing one by one overhead in the slow, darkening sky. He told her with the directness that was his fundamental mode, without preamble or build-up, simply the honest accounting of something he had been carrying for years and wanted to say clearly. "That day you came in," he said, "I had interviewed 4 men who could not do the job. I was ready to try running the season without a bookkeeper and probably failing at it. And then you walked in and sat down and told me my ledger was wrong before you finished introducing yourself. And I knew inside the first minute that you were going to change everything." "You said I was hired before I finished talking," she said, with the mild amusement of someone who has heard a story enough times to know its shape. "Yes," he said, "because it was obvious." She leaned back in her chair, looking at the stars. "I was terrified," she said. He looked at her. "Of the interview, of everything. I had left Abilene with nothing arranged. The Dodge City situation had fallen through before I had a firm alternative. I knew about your advertisement. I had gotten on the mule I had borrowed from the livery man in the last town. I had ridden through a rainstorm, and I walked in there not knowing whether I would have a position or not by the end of the afternoon." She paused. "The mud was from the storm. I thought about stopping to clean up but decided that arriving late would be worse than arriving dirty." He was quiet for a moment. "You looked like someone who had survived something." "I had," she said simply. He reached over and took her hand, which was the gesture they had comfortable and certain, the gesture of people who have been touching each other for 6 years and know the shape of it thoroughly. "I am glad you decided late was worse than dirty," he said. She squeezed his hand. "So am I," she said. The summer of 1885 brought something that changed the texture of things in Caldwell, for a while a dispute over land rights involving 3 of the town's more established families. The kind of dispute that begins as a simple boundary question and becomes, under the pressure of old grievances and the general tendency of property disputes to attract everything else that has been bothering everyone, much larger and more complicated. Graham was involved because the Easton brokerage held the land records for all 3 families. He was in the uncomfortable position of being the person with the most accurate information about the situation, and therefore the one everyone wanted on their side. Fannie handled this with the same careful neutrality she had used on Horace Dent years earlier, not taking sides, not appearing to take sides, being scrupulously accurate with every document and every figure, being equally patient with all 3 parties. She also, quietly, worked backward through the land records to find the original survey documents from the 1860s, which had been incorrectly indexed, and which no one had looked at in 20 years, and which turned out to contain the answer to the boundary question in clean, unambiguous language. The dispute resolved in September when the original survey documents were presented to all 3 parties in the same room at a meeting that Fannie organized with the precision of someone conducting an audit. All 3 parties were surprised. 2 of them were satisfied. 1 of them was not, but they were in the wrong and the documents were clear. And when Marshall Price, who attended the meeting at Fannie's suggestion, confirmed the legal weight of the original survey, the matter was settled. Graham said afterward, "You knew what the survey documents would say before you found them." "I suspected," she said. The boundary as described in the 1874 records did not match the physical description in the 1878 records, which meant either the survey had been redone or something had been transcribed incorrectly. I followed the discrepancy backward. You always follow the discrepancy backward. It is usually where the truth is, she said. He pulled her close and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him briefly in the way that she did when they were in private, and she allowed herself the luxury of simply being held for a moment. And then she straightened and said, "I need to refile those original surveys in a location that will not require 20 years and a property dispute to find them," and went back to work. Their third child arrived in 1886, another boy, smaller than Robert had been and with Graham's gray-blue eyes from the beginning, which was unusual and which Dr. Mears said sometimes faded, but in this case did not, remaining permanently the October sky color that Fannie had first noticed across a desk covered in disordered paperwork. They named him William Thomas William for Graham's brother in Colorado, who by now was writing letters about the mountains with even greater enthusiasm, and who had finally visited in 1884 and met Fannie, and declared to Graham in a private conversation that he had clearly done better than he deserved, which Graham had agreed with entirely. William was a cheerful baby, the easiest of the three in temperament, which was perhaps compensation for the fact that he arrived during the busiest period the brokerage had experienced since the early cattle years, and his parents were grateful for the relative ease of him, even as they were exhausted in the general way of people with 3 children and a demanding business. Robert was 7 and had begun school. Clara was 4 and had begun demanding to also go to school, which was not the arrangement, but which resulted in an informal arrangement where Robert came home each afternoon and reported to Clara on what had been covered, a system that Clara audited with sufficient rigor that Robert's recall improved considerably. The family lived inside the rhythm of the stone house and the brokerage and the town with the quality of a life that has been built rather than happened upon intentional, worked for, attended to. They had arguments and resolved them. They had difficult weeks and recovered from them. They had the ordinary days that are the actual substance of a life, and which are, taken together, the thing most worth having. In 1887, a letter arrived from Graham's brother Will in Colorado, describing a business opportunity in land development in the Colorado foothills that Will wanted Graham's opinion on, and could Graham possibly come out for a week in the summer to look it over. Graham and Fannie discussed this for several evenings. He had not been to Colorado. He had not, in fact, left Kansas in 9 years, except for brief trips to Wichita for brokerage business. The idea of the trip lodged itself somewhere and became a project. They went in July, all 5 of them, because the children had never been on a proper journey, and because Fannie said, with the flat certainty of her best pronouncements, that Robert was 8 and Clara was 5 and William was a year old, and these were exactly the right ages for seeing mountains for the first time. The train from Caldwell to Pueblo, Colorado Territory, with a transfer in Dodge City, took most of 2 days and involved Robert's hat blowing off a station platform, Clara conducting an investigation into the workings of the coal stove in the passenger car that required adult intervention, and William sleeping through the majority of both states with the indifference of the very young to geographic drama. Will Easton met them at the Pueblo station. He was like Graham but louder, broader in his gestures, with the particular openness of someone who has lived alone in a landscape large enough to cure shyness. He shook Graham's hand and then hugged him, which surprised Graham, and then he turned to Fannie and said, "You are exactly how I imagined you from the letters." And she said, "That sounds like there might have been rather specific letters." And he said, "There were," with a grin that told her everything about the letters that she had wanted to know. The mountains were what the mountains always are to someone seeing them for the first time from the plains, overwhelming, excessive, too much to fully receive at once. Robert stood on the station platform looking at the front range with his mouth slightly open in a silence that was, for him, very unusual. Clara stood beside him and said, with the gravity of someone aged 5 announcing a permanent decision, "I'm going to live here when I am grown." Graham looked at Fannie. Fannie looked at the mountains. She thought of the Kansas prairie, which she loved for its openness and its enormous sky and its particular quality of wind, and she thought of the mountains, which were none of those things and which were beautiful in a way that was almost aggressive, and she said quietly, "I understand that completely." They stayed a week. Will's land development opportunity was sound. Graham went over the documents with Fannie's numbers in his head and pronounced it viable, which Will had hoped for, and they spent the rest of the time walking and exploring and eating meals that Will cooked with the enthusiastic competence of someone who has been cooking for himself for years and has developed opinions. Clara attached herself to Will with the speed of a child who has identified a kindred spirit. Robert asked Will approximately 400 questions about mining, because Colorado in 1887 was very much in the mining era, and the evidence of it was everywhere. William was passed between adults and continued his policy of sleeping through most things. On the last evening, sitting outside Will's house with the sky going pink and gold behind the mountains, Will said to Graham, "You built something real, you know, in Caldwell. I see it in the way she talks about it, the way you both talk about the business. It is something you made together." Graham looked at Fannie, who was some distance away with Clara, looking at something Clara had found in the grass, bent down together with the last light on them both. He said, "She built most of it. I just had the sense to let her." Will said, "That is a more important skill than most men figure out." Graham smiled. "She would say I had some input. She is also very gracious," Will said. "She is direct," Graham said. "The graciousness is real, but it is not the same thing." They came back to Caldwell in late July, to the stone house and the brokerage and the particular shape of their life on the Kansas plains. The mountains had been enormous and real and beautiful, and Robert talked about them for weeks, and Clara did indeed maintain, for the rest of her childhood and beyond, that she intended to live there when she was grown. But the return to Caldwell was the return to the place that was theirs, built into over years, known by them, and knowing them in the way that places know people who stay and work and pay attention. In 1889, the Oklahoma land rush changed the geographic and commercial landscape of the region again, and the brokerage handled an extraordinary volume of land records work, as Kansas adjacent territories were settled at speed. Fannie hired 2 more staff members to manage the volume, trained them both herself with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been teaching the work to others long enough to know which parts are intuitive and which parts are not, and to explain the latter accordingly. Robert was 10 and had become, under his own momentum, genuinely good at numbers, not just capable, genuinely talented, with the ability to hold large numerical structures in his head that Fannie recognized as the same gift her father had had, skipping a generation and landing in her son with particular force. She began formally teaching him the bookkeeping methods her father had taught her, and he received these lessons with the kind of hungry attention that made her think of those original evenings at the store in Emporia, learning over her father's shoulder. Clara was 7 and had been formally enrolled in school for 2 years and had, as Clara did all things, made a project of it sitting near the front, asking more questions than any other student, producing work that was careful and complete and turned in early. She had also maintained her piano with a discipline that had surprised both parents and had progressed to the point where Dr. Mears, who taught music alongside her medical practice in what seemed an impossible combination, but apparently was not, told Fannie that Clara had real talent and should be encouraged. William at 3 was primarily interested in the world as a physical problem, how things worked, how they fit together, how they came apart, and what happened when you pressed them too hard. He was not destructive, but he was thorough, and the stone house became accustomed to the sounds of small mechanical investigations. In 1890, Graham turned 43. Fannie had just turned 38. Mrs. Aldred was 76 and still running the boarding house, though she had taken on a young woman named Bess to handle the heavy work, and she still made the best biscuits in Caldwell, a fact she mentioned regularly and accurately. Pete Dolby had a wife and 3 children and had proven, over 12 years, to be one of the most reliable people Graham had ever employed, which was not something either of them had predicted from his first year in the position. The world around Caldwell was changing in the accumulated way of the late 1880s and early 1890s. The The wild open character of the Kishom Trail years was settling into something more domestic, more permanent, the frontier territory of the territory becoming the established character of a state that had been admitted to the Union in 1861 and was now, 30 years later, becoming something denser, more complex. With schools and courts and newspapers and the general machinery of settled life. Kansas was no longer the edge of anything. It was the middle, and the middle of a place means that the rough, urgent energy of the beginning has converted into something different, harder in some ways, more comfortable in others. Caldwell in 1890 was not the Caldwell that Fannie had ridden into on a borrowed mule in the spring of 1878. The streets were the same streets and several of the buildings were the same buildings, but the air of it had changed. The way a person's face changes from youth to middle age, recognizable, carrying its own history, grown into itself. The brokerage was celebrating its 13th year of operation under Graham's name, though everyone in the relevant business communities knew that for 11 of those 13 years it had been a partnership in practice, if not always in name. Fannie had been formally made co-owner in 1885, which Graham had done by simply putting her name on the business documents and telling her about it afterward, which she had objected to only in terms of process. She would have preferred to know about it beforehand, but not in terms of the thing itself. That evening in October of 1890, with the autumn coming in off the plains and the stone house warm and full of the sounds of children and the smell of dinner, and the particular comfort of a place that has been lived in with care for 11 years. Fannie sat at the kitchen table with Robert doing his arithmetic and Clara at the piano in the next room working through a Chopin waltz, which was complicated, but which she was managing in sections with her usual methodical approach. And William on Graham's lap at the other end of the table being read to from a book about horses, because at 4, William had developed an obsession with horses that overrode most other interests. Fannie looked at this scene, this particular arrangement of people and warmth and sound, and felt something that was too large to fit inside a single word, and so existed simply as a full condition, an entire quality of being. The mud-streaked woman on the borrowed mule in the spring of 1878 had arrived carrying a skill nobody had expected, had been hired before she finished talking, and had built, in the 12 years since, a life that was every bit as solid and well-structured as the best ledger she had ever kept, balanced, accurate, clear, with every column adding up. She picked up her pencil and went back to the figures she had been working on, because there was still work to do on the quarterly reconciliation before morning. Graham looked up from the book on horses, caught her eye across the table and said nothing, which was everything. The years continued to do what years do. They passed, and they built, and they changed the shapes of people and places and families in the slow, deliberate way that is not dramatic enough to make a story, but is the actual texture of a life well lived. In 1891, Robert began working in the brokerage on Saturday mornings, running figures under Fannie's supervision with the eager precision of someone who has found the thing they are constitutionally suited for. In 1893, Clara won a music competition in Wichita for her age group and came home with a certificate and the calm certainty of someone who had expected this outcome and was satisfied to have it confirmed. In 1894, William, aged 9, decided he wanted to learn to ride properly, and Graham spent that entire summer teaching him on the land east of the brokerage, patient and thorough the way he was with everything that mattered. In 1895, Mrs. Aldred died in the spring, quietly in her sleep, at 81 years old. The boarding house had been running for 30 years, and she had been its entire character, and her absence from it was the absence of a landmark not just missed but reorienting, requiring a recalculation of where things were in relation to each other. Fannie sat with her the day before she died, not knowing it was the day before, just visiting as she always did, and they talked about nothing very significant and everything very significant in the way of long friendship. And Mrs. Aldred said at the end of it with the satisfaction of a woman who has loved people and seen it come back to her, "You have made a good life, Fanny. Your mother would have been very proud of you," Fanny said. "You would have liked her, Mrs. Aldred. She was funnier than I am." Mrs. Aldred said, "I doubt that," and she was perhaps right. The service was in the church where Fanny and Graham had married, and most of Caldwell came, because Mrs. Aldred had been the kind of person who accumulates genuine affection over decades of small, consistent kindnesses, and the church was full in the way that it is full when a community comes to acknowledge something it will not have again. Graham held Fanny's hand throughout. By 1896, the brokerage had expanded into a third office room and employed 6 people total, and Fanny had taken on, in addition to the accounting and land records, the mentorship of several younger women in the Caldwell area who were interested in bookkeeping as a profession, a quiet, informal network of teaching and recommendation that had placed 5 women in bookkeeping positions in various businesses in the region over 3 years. This was not a formally organized effort. It was simply Fanny doing what Fanny had always done, which was to look at a situation, identify what was needed, and apply her attention to it. Robert was 17 and brilliant, and had begun to talk about university, which was a serious aspiration in 1896 Kansas for a family of their means, and not impossible, but required careful financial planning. Fanny had been doing the planning for 2 years already, of course, which Robert did not know until she presented him with the figures one evening, and told him the account existed and what it held and what the timeline was, and he looked at her with the expression of a 17-year-old boy who has just been shown that he is loved in the language of mathematics and has fully understood the translation. Clara was 14 and ferocious about everything: her music, her schoolwork, her opinions, which she had always had but which in adolescence had become more fully armed. She was not easy, which was fine, because easy had never been the family's primary mode. She was passionate and honest and worked harder than anyone Graham had ever seen except Fanny, and watching her become herself was one of the more extraordinary things he had experienced. William was 11 and horses mostly. Also the mechanics of irrigation systems, which he had become interested in after a conversation with a neighboring farmer about the challenges of dry farming on the Kansas plains. He built a small working model of a windmill pump in the backyard of the stone house, and it worked, and Graham looked at it and thought about his father building the house and the quiet satisfaction of things made with hands and intention. In 1898, Robert went to the University of Kansas in Lawrence. He was 18, and the day they put him on the train in Caldwell, Fanny stood on the platform and held herself with the particular composure of a woman who has prepared for this moment and finds, when it arrives, that preparation is only so useful. Graham stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders and said nothing, which was the right response. Robert looked out the window of the train as it pulled away, and he was the image of both of them: his mother's eyes, his father's stillness, the particular combination of warmth and precision that was the family's character. And then the train took him around the curve and was gone. Fanny said, "He will be excellent." Graham said, "He absolutely will." They walked back to the stone house through the October morning, and the day resumed. Clara, 16, and currently compiling a list of music conservatories in the East with the organized intensity she brought to everything, remained. William, 13 and full of questions about water rights and crop rotation, remained. The brokerage remained, busy and growing and sound. The life they had built continued, as good lives do, not through the absence of difficulty, but through the steady practice of attending to it together, through the application of honesty and precision and the particular quality of love that does not diminish from being treated as a serious matter, but grows from it. On a Sunday in November of 1898, sitting again on the porch of the stone house, the porch that had had its roof repaired 20 years ago and held, with the Kansas autumn doing its particular work on the plains, the prairie grass brown and the sky its cold blue. Graham said, "Do you remember what you told me that evening outside the community hall? The first autumn." Fannie was quiet for a moment, remembering. "I said it was love." "You said at least on my part," he said, "and I said on both parts, and I have been thinking about that exchange for 20 years. What about it? Just that it was exactly true then, and it is more true now, if love can increase without changing its nature. I think it can. I think it does, with time and with the kind of daily choosing that we have both done every day for 20 years. She turned to look at him, and he was the same Graham Easton who had looked up from a disordered desk in April of 1878 with the particular flatness of a man out of patience and also entirely different. 20 years of life making him richer in every line of his face, in every quality of his voice. Hers had done the same, she knew. That was what living with intention did to a person. "Yes," she said, "it can and it does." He took her hand. She leaned into him. The plain spread out in every direction around the stone house, enormous and brown and silent in the late November cold, and the sky above them was the same impossible Kansas sky that had been there when she rode in on that borrowed mule, wearing mud and carrying her leather folder and her father's gift for numbers and her own determination. The sky that had been there before any of them and would be there after, indifferent and magnificent, and exactly the right size for the life that had been built beneath it. Inside, Clara was playing the piano. Something measured and deliberate, and then suddenly large and warm, the way the music went when she was playing for herself rather than for practice, which was the best version of it. William called from somewhere in the yard about something he had found that he wanted to explain. The stone house held them all. Fannie Boone, Fannie Easton, though she had always been, both sat on the porch in the November cold with her husband's hand in hers, and the numbers in her head were quiet for once, and the life she had made was everything she had ever wanted to build and more, which was the best kind of total, the kind that exceeds the estimate, not from error but from abundance.